Here's a short, powerful hook for your story. Asterisk, she pulled me toward her like she'd never let me go, and in that moment, everything I thought I knew about love changed. Asterisk if you want, I can give 5 more variations that are punchy, emotional, and perfect for YouTube shorts or thumbnails. Do you want me to do that? The first time I saw her, it was impossible to ignore the way she carried herself, the quiet gravity that seemed to make the air around her just a little warmer. I had walked into the small cafe, thinking about nothing in particular, a routine escape from my apartment. But the moment she was there, all my focus shifted. She wasn't loud, and she didn't command attention with grand gestures, but there was a presence in her that made everything else fade into the background. She was sitting near the window, sunlight spilling across her hair, catching highlights that glimmered in a way that made me want to look longer than was polite. The faint scent of her perfume, soft, floral, yet slightly musky, drifted across the space between us, subtle but impossible to ignore. I realized, almost uncomfortably, that I was studying her. The way she tilted her head when she laughed quietly, the way her fingers traced the rim of her coffee cup, the small, thoughtful gestures that hinted at a life lived with care and attention. There was an elegance about her that wasn't about clothing or makeup, though she carried herself gracefully. It was in the way she listened to the barista, nodding slightly, eyes attentive and warm, as if every person in the room mattered. And yet, she had this magnetic solitude too, like a story she wasn't quite ready to share. I could feel a pull I hadn't expected, something between curiosity and desire, though I barely knew her. I caught myself wondering if I should leave, whether it was strange to feel this instant fascination. And yet, I found myself inching closer, my own movements careful, hesitant. She looked up, and our eyes met for a brief second, just enough for a quiet jolt to run through me. There was nothing overt in her gaze, no challenge, no flirtation. It was simply presence, warmth, and awareness. And still, I felt seen in a way that left my chest tight. A sudden laugh from a nearby table startled me out of my reverie, and she turned her attention elsewhere, but the echo of her smile lingered in my mind. Even in that small, ordinary space, there was a sense of weight to her, like meeting someone who existed partly in a different world, but who could reach into mine without effort. My fingers itched with the almost absurd urge to reach out, to somehow bridge the space between us, and yet I held back, afraid of crossing a line I didn't fully understand. And then, as I walked toward the counter to grab my own coffee, our hands brushed a fleeting, accidental touch. Her skin was warm, soft, and for a moment, it was as though the world paused, the cafe fading into the background. That single contact, brief as it was, made me acutely aware of everything I hadn't expected to feel: intrigue, longing, a nervous exhilaration I couldn't name. It was just the beginning, but in that small, fleeting moment, I understood something undeniable. She had pulled me in without even trying, and I didn't know how I was ever going to let go. The tea wasn't long after that first encounter that I found myself in her orbit again, almost by accident. Life has a funny way of arranging moments you don't expect. An errand gone slightly wrong, a mutual friends gathering, a late evening at the library where our paths crossed. I told myself it was coincidence, but deep down, I already knew it wasn't. This time, we were forced into proximity. The room wasn't large. It was quiet, lined with books and warm lamplight, the kind of space that made every whisper and laugh feel intimate. I was scanning a shelf when she appeared behind me, her presence as immediate as a sudden note of music in silence. She reached for the same book, and our hands brushed briefly, lightly, as if the world had orchestrated the contact for maximum effect. My pulse skipped, and I caught myself staring at her hand lingering just a fraction longer than necessary. "Sorry," she said, her voice calm, warm, and without any trace of embarrassment. But even in that simple apology, there was a soft charm that made me want to hear her speak forever. Her smile was slight but genuine, and for a heartbeat, I felt the pull again, the kind that leaves your chest tight and your mind inexplicably alive. We fell into a conversation almost effortlessly. She asked what I was reading, and I found myself explaining more animatedly than usual, while she listened with that intense attentiveness that made it impossible not to want to keep talking. Every so often, her fingers would brush against mine as she shifted in the chair across from me, subtle but electrifying, sending warmth up my arm. I was acutely aware of her proximity, the faint scent of her perfume, the soft cadence of her laughter, the way her hair occasionally fell in her eyes, only for her to tuck it behind her ear with a grace I could not forget. At one point, I fumbled, knocking a pen off the table. Before I could bend down, her hand was there, steadying it, and in the process my wrist brushed hers. Her fingers lingered briefly, and I could feel the quiet steadiness of her touch, the subtle pressure that said more than words ever could. There was no rush, no overt intention, just a careful, natural closeness that made my thoughts scatter in the best way. We laughed over small stories, exchanged quiet observations about life, and with every word, every glance, every accidental touch, the space between us felt charged, intimate, unspoken. I caught myself noticing everything: the tilt of her head when she smiled, the way her eyes softened when she listened, the delicate arch of her fingers as she reached for her cup. And when she leaned slightly forward, just enough for our knees to brush under the table, it felt deliberate, gentle, and wholly consuming. As the evening ended and we parted ways, the memory of her lingered. Not just her beauty or charm, but the way she had a presence that pulled you in without asking, the quiet confidence that made her approachable yet untouchable, and the subtle, careful touches that left an impression far deeper than the fleeting moments they lasted. I walked away feeling a strange mix of exhilaration and hesitation. I wanted more, but I also knew this was something delicate, something that couldn't be rushed. And yet, I couldn't shake the certainty that this encounter was just another thread weaving us together, tightening an invisible bond one was already powerless to resist. It happened unexpectedly, as most important things do. We found ourselves alone one evening, the soft hum of the city outside the window creating a backdrop that felt both intimate and safe. The earlier glances, the accidental brushes, the unspoken curiosity, they had all led to this moment. I wasn't sure what I had expected, but the way she looked at me, with quiet attentiveness and a slight softness around her eyes, made me feel like I had stepped into a space that existed only for us. We sat on the sofa, close enough that our knees touched, though neither of us moved to acknowledge it. The distance felt deliberate yet natural, a silent permission to exist near each other without pretense. She spoke first, her voice low and warm, as if she had been holding these words inside for a long time. She shared a story about her past, a memory tinged with both joy and regret, and I listened, mesmerized. Each word seemed to draw me deeper, not just into the story, but into her. I could feel the rhythm of her breathing, the slight quiver in her hands when she gestured, the subtle rise and fall of her shoulders as she laughed softly at the memory. I realized I was sharing, too, something I rarely did with anyone. A fear, a mistake, a fleeting moment of vulnerability that I usually tucked away. And when I spoke, she listened without interruption, without judgment, leaning just a fraction closer so that our arms brushed. That small contact was enough to send a rush of warmth through me, the kind of warmth that lingers long after a hand is removed. I felt seen in a way I hadn't expected, recognized not just for what I showed the world, but for what I carried inside. We laughed at the absurdities of life, but the laughter was punctuated by pauses where words weren't needed. In those silences, there was communication just as deep, a glance that lingered too long, the subtle shift of her body toward mine, the way her hand rested near mine without touching, as if testing the possibility of connection. Each movement was gentle, careful, deliberate in its unspoken meaning. At one point, our hands did meet, fingers brushing lightly as I passed her a cup. She didn't pull away. Instead, she let her hand hover near mine for a heartbeat longer, her thumb grazing the back of my hand, a silent acknowledgement of the closeness between us. It wasn't romantic in a flashy way, but it was electric. The kind of intimacy that forms when two people trust each other with their unspoken selves. By the end of the evening, I was left with a sense of quiet amazement. I hadn't expected to feel this connected, this drawn to someone so completely. Yet there was a gentle pull, emotional and physical, that hinted at something deeper, something neither of us wanted to rush but both already knew was inevitable. As I left, her gaze followed me, and I felt it in my chest long after I stepped into the cool night air. The pull wasn't gone, it had only strengthened. And for the first time, I wondered not if she would let me in, but if I would ever want to be anywhere else. It was during one of those quiet evenings when the world seemed to shrink just for the two of us. The air was soft with the warmth of lamplight, and the city outside hummed faintly, distant enough that our little space felt suspended in time. I had thought I understood the rhythm between us, the delicate dance of proximity and hesitation, but that night, she changed it. We were sitting on the edge of a worn sofa, a thin blanket draped over both our laps. The conversation had drifted from trivial matters, favorite books, odd childhood memories, to something more personal. I was mid-story when I felt her hand lightly touch my arm, steadying me as I gestured. The contact was brief, delicate, almost accidental, but it carried a weight I couldn't ignore. My chest tightened, my pulse quickened, and I realized that she had a way of reaching across the invisible barrier between us without even trying. Her smile lingered, gentle yet knowing, and I felt a sudden, irresistible pull. She shifted closer, and our knees brushed under the blanket, a touch so small yet electric in its subtlety. I wanted to lean in, to close the gap, but hesitation held me back, a fear of moving too fast, of misreading signals, of stepping beyond what was appropriate. And yet, the space between us seemed smaller already, as if she had drawn me into it without a word. Her voice softened, almost a whisper, as she asked a question that seemed simple but carried depth. I answered, careful with my words, and she tilted her head, eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. She reached for my hand, just the tips of her fingers brushing mine. It was a deliberate gesture, gentle but firm enough to convey intention. The warmth of her skin, the quiet steadiness of her touch, sent a shiver through me. I could feel the steady beat of her pulse under my palm, a subtle rhythm that resonated with my own. She leaned back slightly, but not enough to break the connection, and in that movement, I felt the pull again, stronger this time, magnetic, undeniable. Her presence pressed into me in a way that was soft yet commanding, like gravity itself had shifted. My hesitation wavered, replaced by a deep awareness of how close she could make me feel without a single word. We laughed softly over something trivial, and the sound of it mingled with the quiet of the room, wrapping around us like a warm embrace. Every glance, every brush of her fingers, every tilt of her head carried meaning, subtle yet powerful. The world outside had disappeared, leaving only the two of us suspended in the fragile tension of proximity. By the end of the evening, I understood something I hadn't fully realized before. She had pulled me toward her not just physically, but emotionally. The invisible line I had been guarding, the careful distance I had maintained, was dissolving under the weight of her presence. And though I hadn't spoken it aloud, I already knew I didn't want her to ever let go.